Happy Wednesday to all the writers out there in the world, to all of the readers, to all of the creatives, to all of the artists, and anybody who just needs a little magic during the middle of their week. Anybody who's looking for a little bit of beauty during the middle of their week, or a little bit of something fantastic, because that's what fantasy stories do, right? Maybe stories in general, but especially fantasy stories. They give us a little bit of escape. And a lot of people live tough lives, and we like to escape. And doesn't even have to be a form of escapism. It can just be that we enjoy, as people, as social creatures, we like getting out of our own head once in a while and getting into somebody else's head. And that's why reality TV is such a craze, and that's why social media works so well. Is not because the social media apps are so magnificent or genius, but just that they help us peek into the lives of what our friends are doing, and what not just our friends, but our peers and contemporaries, and then people who are way different than us. We get to live in their head for a while and get in their world for a little while. And I feel like the human brain is just too smart. It's like it's too smart for its own good. We need some entertainment once in a while. It's too boring just to be in your own head all the time, eating the same food that you eat every day and listening to the same conversation that you hear every day from your coworkers or your family. It doesn't make those things bad. It's not that your family is inherently boring, or your work is a bad situation, or your town is a bad situation. You can be living a wonderful, fulfilling life, but it's still interesting and entertaining to get out of that once in a while and to be in someone else's life or see what else is possible. And that's what I love about fantasy stories. And what I love about books in particular is you're getting a different world and a different set of thoughts that are more curated. The great thing about social media is you can get more of a candid and immediate approach. You can find out what your friends are actually doing this morning, what they did last night, and what a celebrity ate for breakfast yesterday. And you can get all that information up to date, and it's a constant news feed and stream coming in. And it's sort of like the news. It's always current. It's not evergreen content. It's a steady stream of information that's coming in. But with a book, what's so magical about a book is that you get this package, this curated package that somebody worked on for God knows how long, 1 year, 6 months. Even if someone sat down and wrote you a letter, that it took them an hour to sit down and write you a letter. Well, that's a very special thing, and I love the art of letter writing. And the reason I love it is because you have to sit down in order to do it, and you have to focus. You have to hold another person in your mind. So if I write a letter to my friend, then I have to sit down and take an hour of time where I'm holding the image of my friend forefront in my mind and thinking about nothing else as much as I'm thinking about that friend. And I have this strangely one-sided but also two-sided experience going on where it's only me who's writing and speaking, but it is a two-way exchange because I'm thinking of my friend and I'm imagining what they're thinking and how they would respond to what I'm writing. And so to me, the act of writing a letter is almost, the power in it comes not just from the letter and the finished product and the recipient. The power of the letter writing process actually it affects the writer more than it affects the reader. So the reader, when my friend gets the letter, he can pick it up. He can be in any frame of mind. He might be on his way to work, or he might be in the middle of something else, or he might just skim the letter once while he's watching TV to see if there's any important news. Why the hell did my friend write me a letter? Is he trying to tell me some news that he's having a baby or somebody died? He might skim the letter once while he's watching TV just to see what the juicy information is, and then he might say, okay, I'm going to come back to this later when I have more time. So you can see how it's actually a transformative experience much more for the writer of the letter, because they're the one that does the work of sitting down for, even if it's 20 minutes, and concentrating on their friend and then letting their emotions and feelings come out as they are related to that friend. I think it was Stephen King in On Writing who said that books are a uniquely portable magic. And much in the same way of the letter writing, when we read a book, it's definitely it was more of a transformative experience for the writer to write that book. But to read a book, especially a novel or a story, it does take a lot of concentration. It actually takes work on the reader's part, even though it feels like a sort of a passive and lazy exercise. And when we think about the act of reading a book, we imagine someone just lazing around on the couch or laying in bed with the book propped up on a pillow, and that seems like they might as well be sleeping. They're just being lazy. You definitely don't think of that person as working. But their brain is doing a bit of work, and obviously it's not physical work that we're talking about here. It's the act of transporting your brain into another world, letting your imagination open up and take you out of the room that you're in, out of the bed that you're laying in, or the sofa that you're sitting on, and putting yourself into the feelings and the emotions of the writer, whether that's the protagonist in the story, how you identify with them and their experiences, or even if it's a nonfiction book, you're still being transported into the mind and the experiences of the author, which are so different from your own in so many ways that you can't even begin to count how this other person's experience is different from yours, because they grew up in a different part of the world with different kind of parents and in a different kind of weather and with different teachers and with different friends, and different bad shit happened to them during their life, and different amazing things happened to them during their life. And it's crazy to think about how vastly different someone else's life can be than your own. Because on the surface, there's so many things that we all have in common that it seems like most of us understand what it feels like to wake up in the morning and to go to work and to attend a wedding and to listen to a song that we love and drink tea on a winter morning and lay outside on a hot summer day. And we have so many things in common, so many shared experiences, that it's easy to, it's much harder to put yourself in the mind frame, in the state of another person. And that's because it's not because we're ignorant or stubborn. It's just because we didn't grow up that way. And we all think that what we're experiencing is normal. And that's why it's a little bit shocking when you live with 4 other roommates for the first time, when you first leave your house or you go to college or whatever, and then you think these people are just fucking crazy because they don't act the same way that you do, and they don't deal with conflict the same way that you do, and they don't do the dishes the same way, or they don't have the same priorities when it comes to everyday tasks. And then it's just that shocking on a whole nother level when you get married, or when you have a partner it's not so much marriage, I guess, as it is just living with somebody. When you live with someone, then you see what their normal is, and then you start to clash. What will always happen if you move in with another person, is that you'll see their normal and they'll see your normal, which you don't see with your common everyday friends and acquaintances, because you just see them at work or you just see them at the gym, and you don't see what they look like in the morning when they just woke up, or what they eat for breakfast and all that kind of stuff. But when you live with somebody, you see their normal, and then it irritates you. There's always going to be something that irritates you just because it's different from what your normal is. And so when Stephen King says that books are a uniquely portable magic, I guess maybe I would say there's two things that strike me as really magical about it. So the first thing is that you're getting outside your own head and you're experiencing either the protagonist of the fiction story you're reading, or just the point of view and the opinions of the nonfiction of the writer who's presenting some information to you. No matter what kind of story you're reading, you are getting some sort of new brand of normal. You're getting out of your head and what you think is regular, and you're allowing someone else. There's something, it's not invasive, but there's something, it takes an openness to read a story, to read a book. It takes you sort of putting all your opinions and baggage to the side and being open to whatever the writer is presenting to you. I think that's magic. And then the other thing is that curated aspect that I was talking about, where you're not just getting a passing conversation. That same writer could just talk to you if they passed you by on the street, and you could interact with that author. But you're not getting a social media news feed of just whatever's current, whatever's new. You're not getting the news of the day. What you're getting is a curated package, something that somebody worked really fucking hard on, like the letter writing example that I used, but taken to a whole nother level of effort and blood, sweat, and tears, and not to mention how hard the writer worked on it. But it's always usually a team of people who worked on especially a good novel that you read, or a famous novel that you've read, or a famous book that you've read. Not only has the writer struggled with that for years and years and years, and maybe even thought about the book for so long, or had a whole lifetime of experience to write that book before they wrote it. But then, of course, you have to factor in the editors and the designers and the beta readers and everyone else who worked on the book. And most books are definitely team projects. The writer is the leader, the spearheader of the movement, but then it goes through a lot. The story goes through a lot of filters before it finally reaches the reader. And so I think that's magic too, because when do you get to sit down with your dad? You can have a conversation with your dad, or your grandmother, or your sister, or your best friend, and they can present to you in clear and concise language everything that they feel most passionately about, and they can say it in a way that is emotionally resonant, and in a way that's available, in a way that's beautiful, in a way that makes sense to you. You never get that sort of interaction when you're actually having one-on-one, or when you're actually around people, because, well, why don't you get that? Why don't I get the same sort of value if I'm talking to my friend? Why don't I get the same sort of value as if my friend had spent 2 years writing this book about everything he believes in and cares about most, and then I read his book? Why is that different? Well, you have to say that the book is a higher form of communication, and I would suppose that the book is a more valuable form of communication because of the work that went into it. And then the last thing that I would add is what I love about reading a story or reading the written word is I think there's usually a higher form of truth that's available in a story. If we're comparing, if we're using this example where I can have two forms of communication with my friend, either we can go out to lunch together and we can talk while reading lunch, or my friend writes a book and then one day I get to read that book. In the story that my friend wrote, I feel like I'm going to get a higher form of truth from his story, because even if it's a fiction story, because when my friend wrote the book, he was writing, if he did it well and if he was true to himself, then he wrote the things that were truest to him without the filters of all his friends and families and everyone else's opinions. So it's more personal to him. Whereas in just an everyday conversation, like if you're with your friend at lunch, people aren't when people are interacting, I think on an everyday basis, they're not so usually truth. Maybe this is a cynical thing to say. I don't think it's cynical. I just think when people are interacting, truth is rarely the highest priority. You know, if I'm just talking to my coworker at work, we're not both thinking, I gotta say the most the most correct thing. I gotta be 100% honest and dedicated to the cause of truth. Nobody communicates like that. People are way less interested in truth and more interested in, well, really our own well-being. It's our own survival. That's why if a kid gets caught stealing candy, he might lie or he might blame someone else. Or if a kid farts in class, he's gonna blame his friend because it's funny. But because he's not interested in the truth as much as he's interested in his own well-being. He wants to get by. He doesn't want to get made fun of. He doesn't want to be ridiculed by his peers. He doesn't want to get in trouble by his teachers. He just wants to go throughout the day and do the things that are most enjoyable to him. And we all grow up and we're still kind of just kids on some level, and we're still running that popularity contest, and we're still most interested in our survival. So a lot of people avoid the truth or steer carefully around the truth because a lot of times with the truth there comes conflict. And whoa, I think I just brought it all back around, because what stories really run on conflict, right? Conflict is the gasoline. Conflict is the energy that drives any story. But in our regular everyday lives, we don't want conflict. We want to just get to the next thing. We want things to be as easy as possible. And so if everyone's going around spouting off the truth, like Jim Carrey in that Liar Liar movie back in the 90s, that's one of the worst things you can do, because you're going to be creating conflict wherever you go if you tell people what you really think of them and what you really want to do. And it makes so much sense, because stories live off conflict, and if there's no conflict, then there's no story. That's really storytelling 101, is that you have to have some sort of problem. There has to be tension, there has to be conflict, or else there's no story, or else it's just a boring accounting of events. Oh, we just figured it all out in a very roundabout way. So, speaking of stories, I had a very exciting thing happen to me this week, which is that I got 3 new books. 3 new books. When you live overseas, it's hard to find the books that you want. There are bookstores around. I still like going to bookstores, but when you go to a bookstore and you find English speaking books, you kind of just find the most popular books, or the things you would expect to see in like a airport bookstore, and it's hard to get the books that you want because you have to order the books that you want in order to find not even specialty books, but just anything that's not a bestseller or on the top of the shelf at Barnes and Nobles. So I got 3 new books this week, and I ordered them from Amazon, and they came from America. And I'm going to, man, I just haven't had a chance ever since these books showed up. Well, first of all, I was finishing the Harry Dresden book, which I finished, and then I started reading Wise Man's Fear again by Patrick Rothfuss, because it's just my Name of the Wind and Wise Man's Fear are my favorite books of all time, and I'm coming really close to starting the first draft of my own story, and I just want Patrick Rothfuss to like be in my head, you know? I just want his writing style and his pacing and his language to sort of fill me up so that so that by osmosis I accidentally take some shreds of his writing ability and adopt even just 1% would be nice. If he affects me in that way and I write a little bit like him, then I'll be happy. So I've been reading that, and I finished Fool's Moon by Harry Dresden, which I enjoyed. I like the Harry Dresden books. I appreciate what Jim Butcher does as the godfather of urban fantasy. People love him. The Harry Dresden books are great murder mysteries, and I learn a little bit about the craft of the murder mystery every time I read his stories. There's a murder in the very beginning, and then our wizard detective, goes about trying to figure out who committed the murder, and gets in lots of danger and trouble, and in the end he survives and he saves his friends and he solves the murder. It's genre fiction, and I don't have anything against genre fiction. I want to publish genre fiction. I want to self-publish on Amazon. I guess the only thing I can say, what I'm trying to say, is when I read a Harry Dresden story or any kind of murder mystery, I do enjoy it and I do appreciate it, but I just don't get the same level of enjoyment or the same level of stimulation or get my mind blown in the same way as when I read a story like Name of the Wind or a Brandon Sanderson book, or any of my other all-time favorites like The Hobbit, or something like Harry Potter, or The Lies of Locke Lamora is another one of my favorite fantasy stories that I've talked about on this podcast before. It's a different level when I read a Harry Dresden story. It doesn't give... There's certain books where you're kind of just reading to get to the end, and that's what I feel like when I'm reading Harry Dresden story or a murder mystery. Maybe you don't care about urban fantasy. Maybe you've never read a Harry Dresden story, but you've all read a murder mystery, or you've watched a murder mystery you've seen a movie, or you've watched CSI or NCIS or ABCDE or whatever the hell all those shows are called on TV. We all know how murder mystery works, and we're all entertained by them, and they're all great. But some of those, the way I feel when I read stories like that is I would never want to go back and read any particular chapter of those stories, because the most important thing is the plot. And then once you find out what happens, which is enjoyable, then it's over. Like, I don't ever want to go back and read that book again because I found out what happened. And it's fun to read those kind of stories, and they're great escapism, but it's a different level of enjoyment you get when you read a novel that you really love, or a story that really captivates you. Like when I read these Name of the Wind books, or super fans who just love Harry Potter, those are books that you can go back and read over and over again, because the most important thing is not the ending. The ending is important, but the characters are amazing. The events that happen to them during the middle of the story are fun, and each individual scene is crafted really well, and the scenes turn. You think one thing's going to happen, and another thing happens, and a new character comes in, and those things are enjoyable. Like, I could pick up a Harry Potter book and in the middle of it and enjoy it. It's just a different experience. But I still appreciate Jim Butcher as the godfather of urban fantasy, and I'll keep reading his books, and I'll keep studying. And that's why I am excited about these 3 new fantasy books that I just got, because I think it was Gary Snyder, the poet, Gary Snyder, who said that if you want to be a poet, then the first thing you should do is read every poem ever written. And it's kind of a funny, tongue-in-cheek statement, and procrastinators like me could take advantage of that statement and spend their whole life trying to read every poem ever written before they can ever write their own poem, when there's a lot of authors out there who just jump in and go for it and just do it, and they have a lot of great success. The most successful people are always the doers, right? The ones who can just forget about their insecurities and just do it, just make stuff, just go for it. Those are the people that are gonna be most likely to find success. But there is also truth to that. There's a universal truth to the idea that if you want to be a poet, you should read every poem ever written, and that is you have to, whatever form of art or even business, whatever your job is, you need to learn from the people who've gone before, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, because it has been done before, and there are different styles that have come before you, and so it's important to learn those so that you can find your own voice. That's the holy grail, and the thing that all writers, at least, are chasing after, is to put in enough work studying, enough work reading, enough work doing your own writing, that one day you can create something that's unique, create something that is your own voice. That's the holy grail for me, and I'm pretty sure it is for a lot of writers. So I'm always excited when I get a new story. I especially love just reading the beginning of fantasy stories, because it's such a, I don't know, it's just, to me, it's one of the most fascinating questions, is especially with a fantasy story where you have this world. When you pick up a fantasy story, there's a lot of unknowns as a reader, because even if you like the author or you read the book description and you kind of know what it's about, there's so many unknowns, because we're talking about different worlds here. So it's a funny experience when you're reading a fantasy story, because maybe you don't know that there's going to be goblins in this story, or maybe you don't know that there's going to be fairies in this story, or maybe you don't know that gravity is different on this planet, or maybe you don't know. There's just so much that can surprise you because you don't know the rules of the world, and it's not your everyday world. And that's a delicate process, because the author wants to present these new aspects of his or her world, but at the same time, you don't want to overload the reader with world building right off the bat, because that's just boring and the reader's going to get turned off. Writing advice 101 says that at the very beginning. In your first chapter, you have to introduce your protagonist. You have to show what they care about and give the reader a reason to care about them. So you have to connect on an emotional level with your character while also introducing your world, while also giving just the right amount of information so that the reader is intrigued but not bored by too much information. And so it's just this amazingly difficult process that I know, that's one of the things that the author will revise the most over the course of writing and editing the novel. That first chapter is always getting worked on and rewritten because it's so important, because it's the first impression. Because you're trying to make new friends, you're trying to get people to like you, trying to get people to buy into your story and trust you, and you don't want to make a bad first impression. And so I just love, whenever I get a new story, I love looking at the beginnings. And I just want to share some of that. One, because I think it's fascinating, and two, because I've been so busy lately that I've got these new books that I'm so excited about, but like, when do I have time to just sit down and browse through them? Well, now I have my own podcast, and it's not procrastinating for me to do that because I can do it on the show. So here we go. I am now going to read and react to the first paragraph or the first few pages of 3 different stories. And the first one that I'm going to start with is Neil Gaiman, The Ocean at the End of the Lane. So just a real quick backstory, I'll go fast. I'm writing an urban fantasy novel right now. And so I've been trying to do a lot of research all year about urban fantasy because I never was a big urban fantasy reader before this. And so I had never actually read Neil Gaiman before. He was one of those authors that you just know. We all have authors that we know we should read, or they're popular. We want to get to them one day, but we've just never done it before. I was like that with Neil Gaiman. And then I finally read American Gods last year, and I just didn't love it. I appreciated why it was good, but for all the hype and for all the popularity of American Gods, maybe that was the problem. Part of the problem is that my expectations were too high, but I didn't just fall in love with Neil Gaiman as a writer like I thought I would, or like I thought I should. He kind of reminded me of Stephen King, the way that he told stories, and American Gods I just didn't think was a strong story, even though it was amazing and well thought out and brilliant in a lot of ways. It just didn't pull me through. Like, it took me a long time to read the story because I just was kind of bored in the middle of it. Anyways, I want to learn more about Neil Gaiman. I know he has other amazing books. Maybe it's not just American Gods. And I have to say that I've read the first couple chapters of The Ocean at the End of the Lane, and already I like it more. I feel more drawn into the story, and I'm excited about this one. So here's how it starts. Well, there's a prologue, fantasy. There's a prologue, and the prologue starts like this. I wore a black suit and a white shirt, a black tie and black shoes, all polished and shiny, clothes that normally would make me feel uncomfortable, as if I were in a stolen uniform or pretending to be an adult. Today they gave me comfort of a kind. I was wearing the right clothes for a hard day. I had done my duty in the morning, spoken the words I was meant to speak, and I meant them as I spoke them, and then, when the service was done, I got in my car and I drove randomly, without a plan, with an hour or so to kill before I met more people I had not seen for years. I drove along winding Sussex County roads I only half remembered, until I found myself headed towards the town center, so I turned randomly down another road and took a left and a right. It was only then that I realized where I was going, where I had been going all along, and I grimaced at my own foolishness. I had been driving toward a house that had not existed for decades. I thought of turning around then as I drove down a wide street that had once been a flint lane beside a barley field, of turning back and leaving the past undisturbed, but I was curious. The old house, the one I had lived in for 7 years, from when I was 5 until I was 12, that house had been knocked down and was lost for good. The new house, blah, blah. Okay, that's good enough for an introduction. Then he goes on to describe the house, and he starts to think about his childhood, and he's driving down the country lane. So this story, let's examine it a little bit. In good urban fantasy fashion, this story is told in the first person. American Gods was not told in the first person. American Gods was a third person narrator, more like Stephen King style. And American Gods really jumped around a lot, and it told, it would jump in and out of the story and tell backstory and historical. You have whole chapters about historical mythological beings, and that's one of the reasons that the story kind of plods along. And also the fact that the protagonist is not very compelling. But here we have a guy that we instantly like, and we instantly, at least I do, instantly relate to. So our protagonist is at a funeral, and he starts off by talking about how he's uncomfortable and he doesn't like wearing a suit and tie, and he feels a little bit out of place. And immediately that's great, because that's some detail about the character that is totally relatable, because most people feel like that, right? Most people feel uncomfortable getting all dressed up in a informal attire and going to a funeral, and we can all kind of relate to that weird feeling. And then the protagonist is literally driving down memory lane and remembering his childhood, and he's curious, so I'm a little curious what he's gonna find and where he's going. So we have this fun situation that, again, is very relatable, where the protagonist is older now. He's middle-aged. We don't know what age he is, but he's an adult. He's been in the workforce. He's lived his life. He kind of knows who he is. But now he's back in his hometown. And now he's starting to see things that bring back memories that he has not thought of or experienced for a long time. And that's awesome. That's something that we can all relate to, that we can all appreciate. And I haven't read too far in the story, but the first thing that happens is I guess there's two stories going on, because the protagonist is driving down memory lane, but then he's also recounting his childhood, and he's actually telling the story of being a kid and what he experienced. So the memories are coming back to him, and then he's telling us those memories. And one of the first thing that happens that really kicks the story off is there is a dead body. When he was a kid, they found a dead body in a car down at the end of the lane. And that, I guess, is the inciting incident of the story. And we'll see where it goes from there. But that's the intrigue. And I'm hooked. The first, damn good job, Neil Gaiman. I'm excited. I fucking love the title, The Ocean at the End of the Lane. That's a great fantasy title because it's weird. It's a great urban fantasy title because it's sort of normal but with a twist of weird, which is what urban fantasy is going for. So far, and this is also a short book. When you pick up American Gods, it's this huge hulking Stephen King-sized novel, and that's always a little intimidating, especially if you don't just love. If you love the story, then that's great. You want the book to be as long as it can, but when you're just trying to get through it, that's not a fun feeling. So I'm really excited about Ocean at the End of the Lane. Let's move on to a very less popular book. I don't even remember how I heard about this one, but I found it on Amazon. I wish I remembered now how I found this book because it's not a popular one, but somehow the author captivated me. So congrats to Melissa Albert is her name. And the story is called The Hazel Wood. Maybe it was the cover that brought me in because at least this hardcover edition that I got, it's fucking beautiful. It's this black glossy cover and has gold and silver. So it's sort of understated and simple, but also really brilliant and fantastical. And when you open it, there are these tree floral designs that are really eye-catching. And then when you thumb through the book, there are like custom illustrations at the beginning of each chapter. So just the whole packaging is really brilliant. But on the cover, you have all this fun stuff going on. Like there's a bird and a hand holding a knife and an open bird cage and a bone and a cup that's spilled and all this. It gives you this sort of fantastical fairy tale feel. There's stars and trees and I don't know what there's a big gate with a tree insignia on it, so I don't know what I'm getting into, but the packaging is really, really fun. Like great fantasy stuff. Then when you open the story, before where a dedication would be is a bit of a poem, and I fucking love that when there's a good Stephen King does that a lot. He'll have like a bit of a song, and Neil Gaiman did it too. I love when authors do that, have like a bit of a song or a bit of a poem, something that inspires the story. So in this one, it's a poem where actually the title of the story came from. So it says, it's just 2 lines of a poem. I went out to the Hazel Wood because a fire was in my head. By W.B. Yeats, the song of Wandering Angus. So that's fun. Then you get the Hazel Wood. We know where the title comes from. This classic poem by a classic author. So here's how the story starts. So the very beginning is a little strange. What you have is a excerpt from a magazine, Vanity Fair, 1987, called The Queen of the Hinterland. So I don't know if this was really in the Vanity Fair, if this is true, and then this inspired the author to write the story, or I don't know if this is made up that this was in the magazine. I don't know. But it says, here's the magazine expert. Althea Proserpine is raising her daughter on fairy tales. Once upon a time, she was a girl named Anna Parks, one of the legion of mid-century dreamers who came to Manhattan with their hopes tucked into a suitcase. Then she went missing. Then she came back and achieved an odd kind of fame, glittering from some angles but dark from others. Now she's gone again, fled to a turreted house in the deep, dark woods, where she lives with her 5-year-old daughter and her husband, an actual royal. She just can't quit fairy tales. When I get her on the phone, her voice is alluring as her most famous photo, the one with the ring and the cigarette. I ask if I can come talk to her in person, and her laugh is hot whiskey on ice. You'd get lost on the way to finding me, she says. You'd need breadcrumbs or a spool of thread. Okay, so there's this famous woman who's all about fairy tales. She lives in the woods. Again, you get that sort of Brothers Grimm, classic fairy tale stuff, breadcrumbs and a spool of thread. So there's that magazine excerpt, and then the actual story starts. And it's, I guess, the girl who's telling the story. My mother was raised on fairy tales, but I was raised on highways. My first memory is the smell of hot pavement and the sky through the sunroof, whipping by in a river of blue. My mom tells me that's impossible. Our car doesn't have a sunroof, but I can still close my eyes and see it, so I'm holding on to it. We've crossed the country 100 times in our beater car that smells like French fries and stale coffee and plastic strawberries from the day I fed my Tinkerbell lipstick into the slats of the heater vent. We stayed in so many places with so many people that I never really learned the concept of stranger danger. Which is why when I was 6 years old, I got into an old Buick with a red-headed man I never met and drove with him for 14 hours straight before the cops pulled us over, tipped off by a waitress who recognized my description from the radio. Okay, I'm just skipping forward a little bit to the end of this little scene chapter. My mom and I lived like vagrants, staying with friends till our welcome wore through at the elbows, perching in precarious places, then moving on. We didn't have the luxury of being nostalgic. We didn't have a chance to stand still until the year I turned 17 and Althea died in the Hazel Wood. All right, so I'm not exactly sure what's going on here in this Hazelwood novel. I'm not exactly sure who the crazy lady who lives in the woods is, or who exactly the little girl who's telling the story is, because I thought she was the daughter, but maybe she's not. I don't know. But anyways, you definitely get the feel that you're in. The writer does a fantastic job of giving us all this foreshadowing and context, so we know that we're getting into a real story. This doesn't have the feel of something that somebody just picked up and started writing. This has the feel of something that the author knows exactly where she's taking us. She knows what she's doing. She started off with that magazine article, dropping hints here and there about fairy tales and strange women with strange beliefs, and this young girl with a life on the road. As she was describing, you hear a lot of this advice that as a writer you should try to ground the reader in the five senses. So you try to make your story relatable by diving into the specifics. And this writer, she did a really good job right off the bat of that. She was talking about what her car used to smell like and how she accidentally dropped her lipstick into the heating vent, and so the car always smelled like plasticky strawberries after that. There's all this great detail. That's the thing that I noticed the most reading that introduction, is she does a really good job of grounding the reader in the five senses, letting us know what it felt like to be a kid who basically lives in a car, who's always on the road, and the smell of stale French fries and the sight of the blue sky out the sunroof, and putting us in the head of the little girl and making that world relatable. So first impressions are, I'm not 100% sure what's going on, but that's normal for a fantasy world. What's more important is that I'm intrigued, and I am interested as to why the mother and daughter are on the run and why they lived like this, and who this woman was who raised her kid on fairy tales in the woods. I'm in. Okay, and then the third book that I purchased in my birthday order this year is by Michael J. Sullivan. And the story is called Theft of Swords, and it is volume 1 of the Ryria Revelations. When you look, this is a huge paperback, and it has the whole epic fantasy feel to it. It's called Theft of Swords, so, swords. When you look at the cover, it's epic fantasy because the guys are wearing cloaks and they have swords, and it's obviously, like pre-technological era. This is going to be the kind of story where you have probably kings and gods and dukes and thieves and horses and all that kind of stuff. Yep, so when I open it, there's a map. There's even a list, which is kind of C.S. Lewis style or old school style of There's a list of the gods. I guess it's just also an epic fantasy thing. There's a list of the gods, the names of all the gods, the names of the political parties in the world. And then chapter 1 is called Stolen Letters. Hadrian could see little in the darkness, but he could hear them. The snapping of twigs, the crush of leaves, and the brush of grass. There were more than one, more than 3, and they were closing in. "Don't neither of you move," a harsh voice ordered from the shadows. "We've got arrows aimed at your backs, and we'll drop you in your saddles if you try to run." The speaker was still in the dark eaves of the forest, just a vague movement among the naked branches. "We're just going to lighten your load a bit. No one needs to get hurt. Do as I say, and you'll keep your lives. Don't, and we'll take those too." Hadrian felt his stomach sink, knowing this was his fault. He glanced over at Royce, who sat beside him on his dirty gray mare with his hood up, his face hidden. His friend's head was bowed and shook slightly. Hadrian did not need to see his expression to know what it looked like. "Sorry," he offered. Royce said nothing and just continued to shake his head. All right, I love this story. This is the only one of the 3 books that I've already read, so I know what happens. So we have this fun dynamic right off the bat, which does a really great job of showing what these characters are all about. You have these 2 partners who it turns out they're thieves, but you have these 2 partners, Hadrian and Royce, and they're in the woods, and bandits have surrounded them. And Hadrian knows that he's fucked up, and his partner Royce is just kind of shaking his head. So already you have this funny dynamic where Hadrian, there's like this dangerous situation. It has sort of a superhero feel to it, where Spider-Man is walking through the alley, and then he's surrounded by all these thieves come out of the darkness, and then Spider-Man makes some witty remark like, "Hey, you fellas want to go get a pizza?" or some. I don't fucking know what Spider-Man would say, but it has that feel to it where the heroes, the protagonists, are in this what is a dangerous situation, but it's not really dangerous because they're more talented and they're the heroes, they're the protagonists. So it's this funny dynamic where they're in trouble, but they're not really in trouble. And what's more important to Hadrian, he's not really worried about his life. He's worried that his friend Royce is annoyed with him. This book is one of the best I've ever read at just, I don't know if I would say character development, but the dynamic between the 2 heroes is really fun, and it just gets better and better as the story goes on. And I have a lot of appreciation for the author, Michael J. Sullivan, because I've heard about him on self-publishing sites, and he has done a lot of cool experimental stuff where, well, he's been traditionally published, but he's not pompous or arrogant about it. He's actually explored more into self-publishing more recently in his career, and he's done some cool stuff he just has rabid fans who just love his stuff, and he has experimented with things like selling his books on his own website and trying not to sell them on Amazon. He's very open, and I've seen him share advice on Facebook forums and self-published sites. So I have a lot of respect for the author, Michael J. Sullivan. And this series, I don't know if you pronounce it Rhyria or Rhyria. It's a weird-looking fantasy word, but I listened to a lot of this series on audiobook. I talked about this a while back. I listened to the podcasts, and it was one of the most pleasureful listening experiences I've ever had was listening to this fantasy story in podcast form, episode by episode. And it was a few years ago that I listened to the whole thing. I don't even know how I found it, but I've never actually owned the books. And recently I went back and tried to find those podcasts again, and they're not available anymore. So I wanted to support this author. I wanted to buy his books. I wanted to have one of his books on my shelf because it's a fantasy story that I really like that I've never actually owned because I only listened to the audio book. So if you like a fantasy that sort of has a brevity to it, it's just a clever story and it has a lot of humor and the characters are always bantering together. So there is that kind of superhero action film feel to it, but it's in a epic fantasy land and they're thieves. So they're always pulling off heists and out clevering the opposition and getting themselves in and out of tight spaces. It's a really fun story. It's kind of a light, I guess, as far as epic fantasies go. It's light and humorous and clever and fun. So I definitely recommend Michael J. Sullivan. I also bought his new series, which I think is called Age of the Gods. Let me just look it up real quick so I don't butcher it. Okay, here it is. It's called Age of Myth, not Age of the Gods. Age of Myth is a new series. I just read the first few chapters. My first impression is it's not as good as Theft of Swords, or it's not as catching, but I'm going to keep reading it. But I have that one in my library too, and I like supporting Michael J. Sullivan because he just strikes me as a very honest person and well-meaning author, and I like his fans just love him and will go for anything he writes, which is amazing. And I really respect how he's built that audience. So I'm excited to read Theft of Swords in actual book form. The Hazel Wood is interesting and weird and fantastical. And then The Ocean at the End of the Lane I'm excited about. I hope that's interesting for you. I hope you love being introduced into new worlds as much as I do. And it just makes a great study for me as I write my own stories and I try to think about how do you introduce someone into this new world. Well, you have to do world building, but you have to give a character, you have to present a character who's emotionally resonant with the reader, and that's why it's fun reading. Like what Michael J. Sullivan just did with Hadrian in the forest. He's realized, oh man, I've fucked up, and he's looking at his friend who's disappointed in him. And that's something that we can all relate to, and that's funny, where you have two friends and one has disappointed the other and they're going to be bickering about it as the thieves are closing in. So I'm excited about all these stories. I'm going to end it there because I've been talking for like an hour and a half, even though this episode will be, once I cut it all down, I'm sure it'll be about an hour. But this has been a long one and a good one. So happy Wednesday, everyone. I hope you find time to be creative and to be productive with your art this week, even on a Wednesday, even on a Thursday morning during the mundane, normal work week. I hope you find those half hours and hour chunks of time to read or write or whatever it does that gets you fired up. Whatever it is that gets you fired up. Thank you so much for listening. If you have made it this far, if you've read any of these books or have any feedback on these authors, I'd love to know what you think about them and if I should, which one I should read first. Right now, I'll probably go for Ocean at the End of the Lane just because it's short and I'm also hooked on it. So I'll probably just rush through that one before moving on to the next. Everyone, have a wonderful week. Again, happy Wednesday. And as always, I will be back next week.